watching BlackCoffeePoet.com, and I'm Jorge Antonio Vallejos, and this is Remembering Reena Virk Week, and I'm honored to have these three allies and amazing people who are going to be sharing their knowledge around the Reena Virk case. So, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'm Sheila Bhattacharya, and I'm one of the co-editors, along with Mythili Rahjiva, for the Reena Virk book.
And I'm Tara Etbury, and I'm one of the contributors in the Reena Virk book.
I'm Mandeep, and I am a PhD student, and I'm doing research connected to issues of honor-related violence, and was actually in Victoria when Reena Virk's case came up, and yeah.
Cool. Before we start, I'm just gonna give a disclaimer that the book that we are talking about and the case, the book edited by Sheila Bhattacharya and Mythili Rahjiva, it's not easy to read. I'm sure it wasn't easy to write. So some of the stuff that might come up could trigger things. So just a warning for the viewer that some of the stuff that comes up around this case is not easy to listen to. So thank you for joining me here and for willing to participate in this first roundtable centered on Reena Virk, on remembering Reena Virk. The reason that I asked Sheila to help put this together and to uh, do this roundtable and this whole week around Reena Virk was because to me, Reena Virk was a face without a name, and then later on, a name without a face. I would catch the end of news telecasts and they would have her picture, and I didn't know who that was or who they were talking about, and then later on, I would hear her name and not know any context of the case. And this book, put together by Sheila and her co-editor Mythili, is an amazing book, and Tara's in it as well, and it really talks about the case from a much different perspective. So Sheila, if you could please tell us, and please project your voice, why
Mm-hmm.
you put the book together? Why this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, the idea for the project came from Mythili. So I was introduced to Mythili, and we were talking about the Reena Virk case, and she invited me to co-edit the book with her. So that's how the book came together, and we were both very committed to reframing the murder of Reena Virk and reframing it in the sense of challenging some of the dominant media um, portrayals of the case, um, challenging some of the explanations that circulated, particularly around this idea that it was an example of girl violence. We were very invested in challenging any explanations that um, erased race, as Yasmin Juvani wrote about as well. So that's how the project came to be. And then we had great contributors like Tara and others.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you just talk a little bit about the case? 'Cause I don't think we've mentioned
Yeah,
Reena Virk and everything that's happened and why this book is here.
for sure. So in 1997, in November, um, on November 14th, Reena Virk was murdered by two of her peers. Warren Glowatsky and Kelly Ellard have been charged in her murder and convicted in her murder. Prior to the assault, which resulted in her death, she was assaulted by seven young women and one young man, and that group included Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky. And it was a particularly brutal attack and murder. And what came out in the legal process in terms of the testimonies of the witnesses is that she was targeted specifically. She was accused of certain wrongdoings, according to her peer, the group that attacked her, and she was severely punished. And one of the result of that initial assault afterwards, she was murdered. So this happened in, as I said, November 1997, 14 years ago. And the book looks at the murder of Reena Virk in terms of race and class and gender and histories of colonialism and racism in Canadian society.
Okay. So Tara, your chapter debunks Rebecca Godfrey's book Under the Bridge. Excellent chapter, excellent essay. Could you talk about why you wrote this? Why do you do this work? Why did you want to participate, and why did you submit your chapter to this book?
I think I had read the book. I started reading the book because I had been interested in the Reena Virk case. Like I had followed it just as an example, I think, of the kinds of racism that South Asians do experience in Canada, and specifically South Asian women. And I felt it spoke to that. And so I started reading Rebecca Godfrey's book, and I found it shocking, like the way the story was told, the complete erasure of Reena Virk once again in this book. That Reena Virk is not in the book. This is a book about, the failed innocence of Canada, and I was really interested in critiquing this. So I felt as though it was important to offer a critique because when I then read about the ways in which journalists and the media had taken up Rebecca Godfrey's book, it was all positive press, and there was no mention of the fact that this book erases any trace of Reena Virk as a person, and also any mention that this case is part of systemic racism in Canada.
Yeah, you start off your chapter with Reena Virk was murdered many times, and you keep giving examples. And are those are the examples that you're saying? The media erased her.
Mm-hmm.
Rebecca Godfrey erased her. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think the way in which the story has taken on and still takes on a life of its own, where people use this murder to talk about other things, right? To talk about um, girl violence, to talk about, you know, the supposed death of the Canadian family, to talk about small town life in Canada, and to reassert this mythology that, this is not a Canadian problem. Canada is a free country. We have good families here. They also use this case to try to make conservative claims about young women, that the problem is the girls have gone wild. We need to reel women back into this kind of small town pastoral heteronormative paradigm. So it's the way in which all of this happens, and it happens for political reasons, but it also happens in this grotesque way where she's lost, right? The murder of this person is used by other people, I think, to support conservative political aims.
Mm. So Mandeep, maybe you can comment as well on you were in Victoria at the time that Reena Virk was murdered. Um, can you please tell us about that time period?
Sure. I had just started my first year of university, um, and as a new graduate from high school, I actually grew up in a really small town, just 2 hours north of Victoria, and in a very white blue collar community. And I mean, growing up, I had experienced a lot of racism myself, but never really had the language to talk about it. And also, there was a lot of fear about actually speaking about these issues outside of maybe your own circles, your own home. Um, so I remember when I first entered university and I was starting in child and youth care, and one of the key people who was called upon in the case was an academic by the name of Sibylla Arts. She was the director of our program, and she talked a lot about it as well. And I always remember feeling this sense of discomfort every time it was brought up in the media, in the classroom, in all these different spaces, and not necessarily having the language to know where that discomfort is coming from, but feeling like there really was things that are not being talked about. And then going back home to my community, I come from a Punjabi South Asian community, and her death was very much talked about in the community, but there was a sense of shame, a sense of sadness that the ways in which it was being talked about, and this sense of sort of silence, like, well, this should be an example for other girls in the community to not transgress boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that was the way a lot of deaths that happened for South Asian women, even after Reena Virk, were still framed in that way. Again, this should be an example of ways in which we need to protect women in our community, and so that they don't bring a shame upon our community in the media or in any other ways. And then not really talking about how disturbing and racist these events have happened, and then the impact that has on young people as well. And I think that's the part that is really, really sad about it, and this part that we don't talk about is that when we, as South Asian women, as women in the community, we are there's trauma that happens to us each and every time we hear about these kinds of murders, because we can recall moments in our own lives where racism has happened and violence has happened, and then the violence from the media in itself is also the part that we don't talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So these were sort of things that I remember, I reflect back on, and I remember feeling discomfort and these really intense feelings. And I mean, from then on, I've pursued social work, and have really pursued social justice work around violence against women. And I have to say, I think these were sort of the beginnings of why I maybe pursued those aims in my life, and
Okay.
continue to do so.
That was 14 years ago. Reena Virk was 14 years old, and she was murdered November 14th. So it's this is the um, I don't know if anniversary is the right word. This is the day 14 years ago that Reena Virk was murdered. So it's 14, 14, 14, and it's pretty significant. And it's a case that I think the three of you mentioned earlier that it's not talked about as much because Reena Virk was not a Muslim South Asian woman, or there wasn't a Muslim aspect to this killing, and so that's part of the reason that she's not talked about as much. You would say?
I think, whenever there's violence against a young South Asian woman and the perpetrator is a South Asian person, you're going to see it represented in the media in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is very much the case when there's violence against Muslim women,
Mm-hmm.
right? It gets framed in terms of honor killing, in terms of, this is a cultural problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think the thing with Reena Virk, I mean, it was very much a national story and an international story, because the way it was talked about was that this is an example of a rising trend of girl violence. And for that story to hold together, we saw that Reena Virk and her attackers had to be portrayed as girls, right? So the issue of racial difference and racial inequity was very much excluded from this discussion of girl violence, right? Because they're girls and deviant girls that this happened, right? It wasn't being talked about in terms of the different social locations among the girls, the dynamics in terms of why was she being accused of and punished for certain kinds of sexual, uh, I guess, transgressions, right? So there was no discussion about that. But in terms of, more recent cases that we've seen, I mean, I want to add too that because her attackers were portrayed as white, or there was no discussion about, you know, um, their race, right? So we weren't talking about South Asianness, but we also weren't talking about whiteness, right? That it also wasn't being taken up in the same way that violence against South Asian women um, is taken up in our society when there's a South Asian perpetrator, right? I don't know, Tara, maybe you want to talk about that because you had some really interesting comments
Yeah, I mean,
previously.
I just think about it in relation to the Axa Parvez case, which received so much press, and the Reena Virk case also received press. But the thing is, with stories that often enter the mainstream media, the way they're taken up is nations often construct problems that there are solutions for. So with Axa Parvez, the problem, the way that the problem was framed, is that there is a problem within Muslim families, specifically the Muslim man. And since 9/11, hopefully I don't need to say that much about
Mm-hmm.
why that narrative has gotten so much press, right? That the Muslim man is seen to be the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And he is then going to cause violence. And then the solution becomes, well, then maybe we should limit the amount of Muslims who can come here. Maybe we should ban burqas,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's a whole political kind of strategy. But what is the solution if we frame a murder like Reena Virk's as being one about racism? Then the solution is on the part of the kind of national culture to take stock of, what is going on here and how will that problem be addressed? How will national leaders address that problem? I mean, if you address the problem of Aqsa Parvez as being one about border security and you try to ban burqas, it supports a neoliberal agenda, it supports the war on terror. It's trying to stop, crimes to do with racism in a white settler colony. It's not supporting a conservative government,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Absolutely. Um, in your chapter, Tara, you talk about the savable woman, and you also talk about who and what is being mourned, and that really hit me. And Mythili also talks about that in her chapter, that Reena Virk was being mourned via Kelly Ellard's supposed demise as a white woman, the construct of the innocent, good girl, white woman in Canada. And I had to stop when I read that. It really made me feel uncomfortable and, you know, just it was disturbing. Could the three of you maybe talk about that, the savable woman, and how Reena Virk isn't being mourned, and how this mourning and what is being mourned?
I think you should address it because that's kind of the crux of your
I mean, I
chapter.
think what is being mourned is a mythology about Canada. A
Mm-hmm.
mythology that I call a mythology because it's false, right? This idea of, once in the past we were innocent, good prairie folk, and we, we were nice people, which completely erases the history of this country as a colonizing power, right? That this is a white settler colony, that there's no innocent story to be told. And so I think by mourning this death as, oh, the kids have gone wild, they've lost our good Canadian values, then you can reassert the story of Canada as innocent. It's also interesting that the kids have gone wild narrative comes about also when you have more immigration. So again, the narrative is like Canada has, lost its way. Let's go back to the good old days. So you can simultaneously use this murder to reassert this kind of narrative of white innocence and white racial purity.
One of the things that Ellard said in a video taken of her initial detention at the police station was, this is Victoria. Nobody gets murdered in Victoria, and I think it really that statement really compels us and me to think about how land is constructed along, ideas of gender and race and class and sexuality, right? That, Victoria is being, claims about Victoria are being made about Ellard herself, right? By her in terms of this is a place where violence doesn't happen. And, like if we start to unpack, like how can someone make such a claim like that? Another piece from the legal transcript that I take up is that, um, ladies don't commit crimes like murder. So this idea of, respectable femininity, places where violence does not happen, I mean, these are all ideas underpinning our national story. And these ideas need to be dislodged, because not just the untruth of them, right, but also because these ideas are key to the perpetuation of the violence in our society and the way that young women continue, particularly racially subordinated and Indigenous women, continue to be targeted for and indeed experience violence and murder. And I think that's a really important piece that we've tried to articulate in the book is let's really unpack girl violence, unpack the idea of, Canada as a place of equity and beautiful landscapes and high tea. Like we need to unpack these ideas, particularly because of instances where we see this kind of brutality, but also to be squarely placing the murder of Reena Virk within the continuum of colonial, racist, sexist, heterosexist violence.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add to that, I think that something that we've talked about earlier as well is that there is a history of really extreme history of racialized violence in BC. Everything from the anti-Asian riots that happened to the Komagata Maru that we don't talk about, or we don't even connect to these situations or to these cases. And I think that there's a total erasure of even who Reena Virk was and how she may be connected to that. And even all South Asian communities, and when violence does happen, how we are connected to having a history of being violated in those ways because of race. Um, and even just the colonialism that we maybe come from back home, and how that might be connected to our own stories of survival here, and stories and our connection to other communities here.
I'd like to point out that I think there was a very responsible scholarship and allyship in the book, because you made the connections with how this is stolen land. This is originally indigenous land, different indigenous nations, and the violence that has happened and continues to happen with the genocidal practices. But you didn't use the Aboriginal struggle and history to further your own book or cause. And I think that's something that people can learn from, because I've read many things, or many activist groups across the country use indigenous struggles to further their own cause. And it's just insulting in so many ways to obviously indigenous folk, but also other activists like you guys who are trying to do and doing very good work, and in a responsible way and in true allyship, I have to say. So that came out to me a lot when I was reading the chapters. And I was like, this is good. They're not using the original peoples to further their own cause, but they're respecting the fact that they are on indigenous land and they know the real history of this land, which isn't a pretty one, and you make the connections. And I think that was very, very, very well done.
I think it's really important, but it's also, it's how I see our our role as being activists, researchers, or scholars, right? Is it's about, seeing how things are connected or disconnected. It's never just one or the other, right? And I know that I can only I speak for myself, like, I am really indebted to Indigenous, anti-colonial, feminist scholarship, as I am to, African Canadian and American scholarship, and, the scholarships of other subordinated peoples. And the thing that is so important, I think, is to look at something like, how is girl violence constructed? Well, it's constructed based on a certain idea of femininity. That idea of femininity is white, respectable, heterosexual, able-bodied. Okay, well, who's the counterpoint to that social identity? And we need to look back into our histories and see how, in one instance, it's South Asian women who are seen as a threat to white settler nationhood. We need to make sure that any of the South Asian men who have come to Canada to work in the lumber industry are not allowed to bring their partners and wives. We need to also be looking at how Indigenous women are positioned as a counterpoint to white women as, you know, important nation builders.
Yes.
Right? So, these ideas of dominant, subordinate social location, I think it's really important to kind of pick those apart, because that's what underlies this, immediate acceptance of this idea of girl violence,
Yeah.
and that the solution is that we need to control our girls more.
Right.
What does that really mean?
Yeah.
When you're looking at it from a white settler project
Yeah.
perspective?
We've got just a few minutes left here. I'd like to point out also that in your book it says Kelly Ellard was the only person ever in Canadian history to be tried 3 times for
I
a
think
murder.
I might not I know for sure the call for a fourth trial was unprecedented.
Unprecedented, yeah.
I think 3 trials may have been a precedent as well.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised, but her third trial was appealed and a fourth trial was ordered, which is unprecedented. The
It's
Supreme Court actually overruled,
jeez.
reinstated the guilty verdict. But
Mhm.
I think, it was complicated. That whole legal process was very complicated by race and gender and class and sexuality, all of which was never addressed,
Mhm.
but it was part of what was going on at every trial, in every media article, and never addressed. And I would argue that that's part of the reason why 3 trials and a fourth was ordered,
Mhm.
was Canada and, in some ways maybe our legal system's inability to deal with what was glaring
Mhm.
to
Right.
most,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
But not addressed.
So again, we have very little time left, but I know Tara, what was really important to you. You wanted to talk about the possible film or current film being made.
Yeah, so I've heard the latest press that I've read has said that Reese, Legally Blonde Witherspoon, will be making a film um, that that is based on Rebecca Godfrey's true crime novel about the case of Reena Virk. And I've also heard that Warren Glowatsky, who murdered Reena Virk, one of his first acts as a free man out on parole was to act, is to act as a consultant on the film, a paid position. And I think it's just unconscionable. I'm sorry, I think it's just completely lacking conscience,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's also, um, I think it's deeply political, right? I mean, there are other cases in which, people are not allowed to speak publicly about, you know, their trials as part of their parole hearing or part of their
Mhm.
parole deal. And he is allowed to not only speak publicly but to make money off of this crime that he committed. And I think that there should be, and there will be, and there can be a political and scholarly response to this film if and when it is released.
Well, thank you very much. Is there any last words you would like to say? Okay. Well,
Just thank you very
Yeah,
much for
thank
inviting us
you.
to participate.
well,
Yeah.
thank you again. Reena Virk was a face without a name and a name without a face, and I think she's probably that for a lot of people. Some people might know the name Reena Virk, not see a face, or have seen her face and don't know the case. And we had a short amount of time here. We did our best. I hope that it was educational, and it was definitely a different perspective, which is what this book is about. Reena Virk, Critical Perspectives on a Canadian Murder. Please watch the video, and there's a significant number to this video and to this case. And if you email me at blackcoffeepoet@gmail.com with that answer, what is the significant number? There are 3 books being given away by the press, Canadian Scholars Press. They've offered to give 3 books away as part of this special week remembering Reena Virk. So email me at blackcoffeepoet@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us here on blackcoffeepoet.com. And please get this book, read it, share it, please share this video, and please join us in future on blackcoffeepoet.com. Thank you very much for joining us, and please stay tuned for more special weeks in future. Thank you so much.
Thank